Good afternoon. Regardless of where you are and what time it is for you right now, I send you a warm greeting. My name is Laura González, and today I want to introduce you to the project of the millennial Ceiba. And this story begins like this. A very long time ago, our ancestors, our forefathers, had a deep and sacred relationship with the stars, with the planets, with the mountains, with the water, and with the living plants and all of nature, which was very different from the relationship we have today. For them, each of these elements, to call them that in some way, was conceived as a living being. And this is precisely what has allowed Dr. Carolyn Merchant to identify these types of conceptions of existence as organic conceptions. They were organic because what was at their very core was the fundamental idea of life itself. Currently, however, the parameters we have for relating to these beings are quite different. We are the product of a complex set of historical processes, of specific moments and circumstances that have caused this traditional conception of life of an organic nature to become increasingly fragmented. In this organic conception of life that Carolyn Merchant described, there were two components that were supremely important. Looking at it from one perspective, we had a very specific understanding of the tangible and material characteristics of all these beings. That is, that physical part, that visible part, that allowed water to be considered as a being that satisfied our basic and essential needs, which have been the same for the entire human species throughout our existence. But also those immaterial dimensions of these same beings. This immaterial dimension is what allowed our ancestors to consider this same water, which served to quench thirst, as an element to help grow or to nourish the spirit and also the soul of human beings. That is why water has been fundamental in many initiation rites, purification rites, and has been present in many moments of sacredness throughout human history. Therefore, the combination of these two elements in this space of the ancient Ceiba tree, we'll call it the whole. The entirety of the whole will be the sum of all these material components and the immaterial aspects present in all these elements. These mountains, the water, the stars, the planets, the trees, and also within ourselves. And it's fascinating to consider the fact that for our ancestors, being conceived as living beings, this perspective essentially facilitated the generation of a certain type of deep interrelation with these various diverse and interconnected elements of the whole. But unfortunately, as I mentioned, this way of understanding life, this way of understanding existence, well, it has been getting lost. And what are the reasons? Well, to talk about the specific reasons for this sudden rupture, first I really want to mention that I'm telling you this entire story from right here in Ecuador, this beautiful little piece of land that by the many strange twists of fate and history has eventually come to be called Ecuador. Within this specific territory and in a broader context, which is the Latin American one, well, a power structure has been identified that is exceptionally fascinating and significant, and it provides a framework for us to better understand the reasons for this rupture. It is what the Peruvian scholar Aníbal Quijano has formally characterized and described as the coloniality of power. What is this coloniality of power? This coloniality of power is a power structure, if you'll excuse the redundancy, that was established in our continent and throughout Latin American territory, starting from the arrival of the Europeans more than 500 years ago. So it is essentially a complex process of constructing a systemic power structure that is rooted in a Eurocentric origin. This is a process that has gradually resulted in the development of a large part or almost all of our institutions, well, being built while thinking about or in the likeness of the European models and structures that have been present throughout these 500 years. So much so that, for example, we have institutions like the modern nation state, as well as various ecclesiastical institutions. We follow an economic model, such as capitalism. We also have an educational model that originally emerged from that region, which is basically centered on scientific work and research, and this serves as a response to the historical process of admiration and respect for the cultural and scientific achievements of the European world. This process of admiration for the colonizers or those who hold power has also been analyzed by Homi Bhabha, who has described how victims ultimately end up admiring the victimizers and seek to reproduce this power structure internally, the power structure they are receiving but already internally. This power dynamic Homi Bhabha identifies as colonial mimicry. So this Eurocentric historical origin has been absolutely fundamental to understanding how these processes of institutionality at the political, spiritual, economic, and educational levels. Just to mention a few of the specific fields into which the modern world, is also divided. Well, they have been built in the exact likeness and structure of these traditional canons, and have in some way given rise to this gradual rupture of this organic conception with the whole. How does this rupture work? For example, let's talk about the state. The state is currently understood and conceived as a political entity in which all aspects and matters relating to human life are carefully described, deeply questioned, or actively managed. Regarding this, Dr. Rita Segato has described this as the hijacking of politics. This hijacking has led to all matters considered relevant to human activity being concentrated in this state space, and in the various institutions that are linked in some way to this central institution. On the other hand, we have, for example, the church or churches that, through their various missions, have managed to systematically eradicate or systematically impose other ways of conceiving the spirituality that was latent in these lands. Thus, these sacred elements, for example, flowing water, majestic mountains, and various ancient deities, were gradually replaced over a long period of time by figures of a more anthropomorphic nature. This is because this entirely complex historical and social process responds directly to the systematic establishment and normalization of anthropocentrism within the ever-present framework of the coloniality of power. We also have the undeniable, dominant, and pervasive reality of global capital, which is one of the most aggressive factors in the process of establishing this fundamental rupture, which has two major and highly influential aspects: industrial production and mass consumption, which have also significantly influenced and further deepened the overall extent of this rupture. How has this worked? Well, these two elements are part of a single being. They constitute two arms of the same capitalist process and the establishment of an economic model within the framework of the coloniality of power in these lands from which I am speaking to you. On the one hand, we have the productive logics related to the systematic extraction and harvesting of what is now conceived as resources, and which currently relate to or are maximized through industrialization processes that, as is well known, involve an aggressive use of all these small parts that we find in the different elements of the whole. But on the other hand, we also have this logic of consumption. While in Latin America, the primary social struggles and widespread movements have been focused specifically on addressing the issue of production, we have gradually lost sight of the critical factors related to consumption. As we know, almost the entire issue of social struggle has been questioning who the owners of the means of production are, whether it's private capital or if it should be the state. There have been many bloody struggles for the appropriation of these means of production, but the issue of consumption has been left aside. And while on the one hand, we may be fighting to be more or less producers for a sector, for the state, for companies, whatever the case may be, to be great consumers, we have to develop other types of skills, other types of principles and values that are sometimes not observed. So in this field here, the issue of development, for example, is of great importance. Development must be seen as a discursive object. The Colombian sociologist Arturo Escobar has worked in great depth in his book, The Invention of the Third World, explaining how these types of concepts like development, poverty, and the third world have been established as discursive objects that were introduced into our lands after the Second World War, that is, within the framework of a geopolitical configuration that sought to satisfy certain types of interests originating here. But for this, we're going to take a moment for a brief clarification. While this process began in, let's say, this power matrix began in Europe, it has been changing its form, and now we can find this distribution of power in a North-South scheme. North and South must be understood as mobile categories. We're not talking about large human groups or institutions or states that are on one side or the other, and that constitute human groups in confrontation. No. But we are talking about a power structure originating here that gradually became this relationship, which is somewhat mobile. Later on, we'll talk about how this configuration has come about, but for now, suffice it to say that it's important to understand that these are mobile categories and that they still allow us to understand our place within the map of geopolitical power. In the Ecuadorian case, we are clearly in the south, but this north can keep changing. This north can be a major north like the United States, or it can be a medium north like Brazil, if we're talking within the economic logic of capitalist globalization processes. So we have to understand these categories as mobile and fluctuating categories. On the other hand, we also have the educational field, and this is a field of great importance, especially because of the question of science. The American doctor Carolyn Merchant has analyzed how, following the establishment of the scientific method in the field of knowledge, certain parameters of power and control were established over everything we conceive of today as nature. In her text on the death of nature, she progressively analyzes how the scientific method became a kind of large umbrella that fostered this rupture of the organic conception of life. And how has this relationship come about? Well, it's been a super slow process in which a way of understanding the whole has been institutionalized, in which this conception has been severed and only those components of material origin have been left. Do you remember we talked about how the whole has two parts, a material part and an immaterial part? Well, with the establishment of the scientific method, what has been promoted is the supremacy of this material part over all those immaterial aspects that have been considered second order and that have been considered secondary and as irrelevant elements for the constitution of life. Thanks to the principles of objectivity, the search for axioms of truth, and large-scale theoretical postulates, it has been achieved that gradually this series of principles has been teaching us as humanity that this part is the only one that is relevant to our lives, and that it is the only functional part for the life of human beings, and the one we should occupy ourselves with. So the establishment of this scientific method is one of the major factors that has allowed the severing of this organic conception of life. Well, in this context, it is also important to make a clarification. The analysis or description of this set of institutions and processes that have achieved this rupture or this fragmentation of the organic conception of life is not a criticism of science, because we must recognize, and it is important to keep in mind, that science has achieved many advances. It has managed to save many human lives, but we do see that there is an imbalance. And in this, I also want to add or establish a principle that is very, very important for the Ceiba. While French authors have managed to contribute many ideas, social categories, and conceptions of life that have served and have been the primary basis for the construction of the social sciences, and the great thought that pervades us today, I consider it important to establish theoretical categories or conceptual categories that allow us to understand life from this integrality. For it is clear, for example, that positivism of French origin could not account for this immaterial nature, precisely because it is based on this and on all the principles of the scientific method and everything that has been seen. So it is here in these two components that precisely we, given the heritage we have here and given the origin of the thought that we have, well, we consider it important to work on new conceptual conceptions that allow us to understand these two variables. And for this, we are going to talk, for example, about the spiral. The spiral is the base of the double spiral, the symbol of duality. It is a symbol that has been present in many cultures, in many archaeological traces, but it is a symbol of duality. And duality is a principle that has also been present in many cultures. One of the most famous may perhaps be the yin-yang, the symbol of the yin-yang. This famous symbol speaks of the same thing, of duality. In this case, these two parameters of the material and the immaterial are represented in this symbol. And why do we use this conception that might seem strange? Because we cannot understand life if we do not follow, or if we do not take symbols of existence that have been much more defining and much more complex, as in this case, the double spiral. That on one hand. And on the other hand, because we see that one of the great consequences of this rupture of the organic form we had before has given rise to what is today conceived as the climate crisis. The words climate crisis sound like something technical, they sound like an algorithm, they sound like strange knowledge that somehow tells us that in such a place it is raining too much and that people are being flooded, and that on the other hand there are people who are suffering a great drought and have no way to produce food. In one way or another, it is an expression that does not allow us to connect in a more integral way and to bring into public reflection this relationship with the whole. Because while the climate crisis responds mainly to the issue of capital and everything it is generating in its wake, the climate crisis also tells us that here there is a rupture. There is a rupture because we have remained precisely in this material dimension and we have forgotten this immaterial dimension. And within the ancestral worldviews that are still latent in this land from which I am speaking to you, like Ecuador, balance is very important. So this is where the importance of the double spiral comes in as a symbol of balance that we are going to work with from La Ceiba. All these phenomena that are currently happening, which I have briefly mentioned here, have been mapped by many authors. They have been approached from an economic perspective that speaks to us of an imperialism, of a sub-imperialism as Rui Mauro Marini analyzed it, speaking of Brazil's relationship with large countries like the United States, large in the sense of where the capitalist system is mostly consolidated. There have also been analyses of the BRICS. There have also been analyses, on the other hand, of this kind of cultural globalization, which Castells has described very well, which are analyses that in one way or another have allowed us to see the existence of this power structure from which the world is being configured, where there is a source from which ideas, principles, and values emerge that are teaching us or telling us how we should exist. And this is reflected in the sense of everyday life that we have built. Regardless of the circumstances we're in, it's very likely that one day we'll wake up, probably in an urban setting, open our eyes, maybe prepare breakfast, maybe go see our children, maybe get ready for work, maybe go out for a jog, a run, or a bike ride. Whatever the case may be, most human beings have configured a daily life in which this relationship with the whole is not present. There are no longer these elements that allowed our ancestors to establish a connection with each of these elements that are fundamental to our existence in an organic way. And what is this mechanism that these people had to establish this relationship? And this is through sacredness. The sacred. Sacredness is a word that can sometimes generate a certain degree of fear, a certain degree of rejection, because precisely in the process of establishing modernity, of establishing this whole structure of a geopolitical nature, well, we have learned to have a rejection of all these aspects of an immaterial nature. Currently, many of these elements, for example, constitute ancestral knowledge that is still put into practice in this land, in the lands of neighboring countries, and in many places around the world. And in this power structure, the only reach they have is a discursive recognition at the level of cultural heritage. But they do not come to constitute knowledge, forms of existence that can be conceived as ontologically complete and with the capacity or the projection to be able to generate a change at a global level, because they are relegated to this world of the cultural. Sacredness is what allowed the elders to have a connection with all the elements of life. So what is the sacred? The sacred is that which allows us to have a connection with the different levels of life, both the visible ones, but especially with the invisible ones, with those that do not pass through the use of the senses traditionally prioritized in the framework of the establishment of the scientific method, such as reason, such as sight, but rather require the development of other types of skills, of other types of conditions to be able to be integrated into the lives of human beings and of the different communities. But this is sacredness. Sacredness is what allows us to recognize this awareness of life itself, this profound awareness of our connection with everything that surrounds us at different levels. From a simpler and more straightforward perspective, for example, we can find sacredness in the planting of food and in its harvest. And from there, at the other extreme, in a process of abstraction, it's present in those rituals, properly speaking, which are oriented precisely to create the conditions to generate awareness in those attending the ritual of having this connection with the whole. So sacredness is present in everything. It can be present in any human activity. And that was precisely the awareness that our ancestors had and that has been lost today. North-South relations have complicated a bit the identification or the source, the matrix of all these elements that are establishing a single source or a single way of seeing life. We're going to talk in this case about the Western matrix for existence. Why is it the matrix? Because obviously it's a source from which ideas radiate, rain down to different places. Ideas, principles, values that are telling us how to relate to the whole and that are translated in a concrete way into the institutional mechanisms, of which I was speaking to you previously and that have configured a sense of everyday life in which we are all immersed. It's Western because in the process of establishing colonization and coloniality, well, the world was being configured. In relation to this, which was conceived as the West versus the East, which is a conceptual issue that has been debated and that has been criticized, because finally, geographically, there isn't necessarily a West and an East. But given that in this historical process, discursively one spoke of the East versus the West, well, we're going to talk about a Western matrix because it's from there that it's born. In the processes of European conquest, the Earth was classified into East and West according to its geographical location with respect to Europe. Western matrix for existence. Because what is being established behind the entire installation of this map that we are describing is a way of existing. What we are learning is how we should exist, how we should relate to all these elements. So this is when we are talking in an integral way. Beyond the specific description of a sociological problem, of a natural problem, if you will, of the climate crisis, beyond the economic consequences that this climate crisis will generate, we consider that understanding this globally as a Western matrix for existence will give us parameters to think about this institutionality in which we are going to work. When I speak of us, I mean the millennial Ceiba. The Millennial Ceiba is a social organization created to address the issue of sacredness. We are interested in working precisely on the restitution of this relationship, above all of this immaterial aspect of life. We are interested in working on its recognition, its existence, and its understanding as part of human nature. That is why we are going to honor a principle of the philosophical conception held by the Haitian people. They have a very beautiful phrase that says, "Tout monde se monde," which means every person is a person. And what does that mean? That means that all people have the same rights, the same capacities, the same skills. And that is why we can also feel or reflect ourselves in these ancestors who had the possibility of establishing a relationship with the whole. In this sense, it is also important to mention all the work that has been done by authors such as René Guénon, Mircea Eliade, Eliphas Levi, who precisely, starting from this matrix of a Eurocentric nature, worked on systematizing what the experiences have been that are related to this field of the immaterial and that are still present in many places in the world. to tell us in a very, very summarized way that sacredness is an essentially human institution and that it has been forgotten within the framework of the establishment of all these processes of power of the North-South historical construction. So what sometimes seems to be the naive product of modernity, what we sometimes think has been something overcome by these parameters of the modern, of the new, by these conceptions of what human progress means, in reality, respond to these processes of a political nature that we are describing at this moment. To the coloniality of power, to the establishment of states, to the hijacking of politics that has occurred there, to the church and the construction of a perspective of divinity in which God and divinity are found outside of us. We also have it in the case of capital, we also have it in education. In all these institutions, this great idea of a break with the organic is reflected. In the midst of all this scenario, which undoubtedly has a lot of factors that we will analyze progressively, the ancient Ceiba is born. The ancient ceiba is a large tree with beautiful roots that spread throughout the territory, with an enormous trunk and giant, beautiful branches, which can produce white pink flowers, which in turn turn into cotton, which has served as shelter for many peoples in the world. The ceiba, or the ceibo, has always been a very important and significant tree for the peoples of Mesoamerica, for the Mayans, for the Amazonian peoples, for the Quichua communities, and also for my own land of my maternal lineage, which is the region of Manabí. The ceiba, or the ceibo, as it has been known in many places, has been considered a sacred tree because in one way or another, it has helped human beings and our ancestors to establish a relationship with these two aspects of reality, with the material and with the immaterial. And with this immaterial dimension in many senses, in many ways of understanding what happens on this other side, with worlds above, with worlds below, with worlds where they feel, with worlds where one can dream, where another type of institutionality exists that works, which has been clearly identified by the authors I mentioned earlier. That is why the ceiba has been defined as a sacred tree, and now this beautiful tree lends us its name to be able to work on this project. In the ceiba, we are going to dedicate ourselves to the restitution of these two aspects, which we consider with great care and attention can be described as sacred memory. It is this memory that allowed our elders, our grandparents, to establish the relationship with everything I mentioned, with the water, with the flowers, with the animals, beyond the utilitarian perspective that has transcended in these moments of history, and that is considered the only possible source of connection. In the ceiba, we are going to work to understand what the causes for the loss of this sacred memory have been, but also the consequences of this rupture. We've already mentioned some of the causes, and we'll be working through them progressively. One of the consequences was also mentioned, which is the climate crisis. And another major consequence that we're going to work on is cancer. Cancer is a horrible, painful disease. It's a problem that's growing and growing in the world, and the discussion of it is confined to the health field. But little or almost nothing is done or discussed from the perspective of the social and human relations behind this massive problem. According to the National Cancer Institute of the United States government, there are certain risk factors that can cause cancer. These include alcohol, diet, age, infectious germs, hormones, chronic inflammation, immunosuppression, sunlight, obesity, radiation, tobacco, and environmental substances. These environmental substances are those exogenous factors that may be influencing the development of cancer. And this is the topic that interests us at the Ceiba Milenaria. The creation and use of these substances, which are very likely causing cancer in many people all around the world, are deeply connected to and intertwined with the structure of the coloniality of power that we are describing. Cancer also responds to this rupture, and it does so to the extent that we have set aside this direct and immediate relationship with these essential elements that together make up the whole. To give an example, in the field of nutrition. as we've grown accustomed to the urban setting, as we become professionals, and as we adopt the idea that intellectual work is superior to physical work, which is one of the principles or values established in this framework, in this power structure of the coloniality of power and the North-South relationship, we've unlearned and forgotten the possibility of growing our own food, of depending directly as families or as communities on the land. So what has happened? We go to the city, we migrate, we go through educational institutions, we become professionals, and our food, the most important thing for our human survival, is left in the hands of large industries, of large companies, which simply replicate this relationship of rupture with the whole. For large-scale food production, it's well known that monoculture production is very necessary. When there are large tracts of land and only one food is produced, the ecological balance between animals and all the beings that make up the different chains that usually balance each other no longer exists. And large chemical components are required to be able to attack the pests that threaten the life of these plants that are produced on a large scale. And that's where, for example, the role of agrochemicals comes in. These agrochemicals pass into the plants, and then when they are consumed by humans, well, we also ingest these toxic components in some way. And one of the consequences of this consumption of this type of food, well, is cancer. So in this process of capital that I mentioned earlier, there is an expansion of life in which we increasingly entrust the important responsibility to various large companies of satisfying different types of needs, such as food, just to mention a few for now. And here, in this expansion of life, well, the direct link with what we consider to be of lesser value, something obsolete, something secondary, is also being lost. Again, I repeat, within the framework of the establishment of values of supremacy, according to capitalist modernity. So cancer is also a consequence of the loss of this sacred memory. At La Ceiba, we are going to work by analyzing and studying all these factors that I am telling you about, but we will also have a practical component. We will have a part for sharing ideas and expressing our thoughts. But we will also have concrete projects that will work directly on the construction and strengthening of bonds. This is what we are going to call relinking. Relinking is the construction of bonds, of ties, of connections, with all the elements that are part of the whole, whether of a material or immaterial nature, with the aim of gradually, progressively overcoming the establishment of this anthropocentric conception of life that is causing us so much harm. We hope to gradually let you know what these initiatives are, and we also hope that you can join us by listening and sharing these ideas that we are working on. And above all, thinking that it could be an alternative to what is happening and what is causing us many problems. Especially for those of us who are parents and have the responsibility to think about the lives of our children in the future, it is important to think about the living conditions they will have in the future. And we consider from La Ceiba Milenaria that those conditions can change, can improve, and can allow for life in the future, as long as what humanity has lost, which is sacred memory, can be restored. That is all for now. We look forward to seeing you in the next chapters. Thank you very much.